Okay, so our case study for a urban area or city in the UK is Newcastle. So we're going to lay out our diagram in a rough structure like we've got out here, obviously with our castle in the middle as a kind of little visual cue to remember what our case study is. The first thing that we need to consider is actually where is it? You know, if we were to describe the location of our chosen city in the UK. Importantly to remember is that Newcastle is located in the north east of the UK, on the coast with the North Sea. So we've got the NE for the North East, NS for the North Sea. It is also on the banks of the River Tyne. Those two key features, really important to remember in describing its location. We're then going to move on to looking at how important it is. We need to look at why Newcastle would be considered an important city, both on a national scale within the UK and on a global scale. So here we're going to be looking at this idea of importance. So we'll start off with the national scale. Okay, why it's important on a national scale. Firstly, since the global recession, Newcastle has the third fastest growing economy in the UK. That is behind London and Bristol. On top of that, it's the seventh largest city in the UK by population. And considering its regional location in the northeast, it is also the retail centre for that part of the country. So therefore, on a national scale, it is a significantly important city. On a global scale as well, it has several things that lead us to be able to prove that Newcastle is a globally important city. First off, it has Newcastle docks. Shall we show that with our boat? Now what's important about the Newcastle docks is that it provides Newcastle with a link to other parts of the world, particularly the rest of Europe and, for example, Scandinavia. It has a ferry terminal where cruise liners will dock and leave from, but most important is where it works as an industrial port. Okay, 600,000 cars are exported through Newcastle port out of the UK every year. Also, it is world famous for its half marathon, okay, the Great Run. I'm going to try and draw a man kind of running there. Okay. That event has a huge amount, the Great North Run has a huge amount of international sort of attention with hugely famous athletes, including Mo Farah, running at it, and it receives a huge amount of attention and television from across the world. We then want to look at how Newcastle is changing in terms of its population structure and the impact that migration has on the population structure of Newcastle. Now, interestingly, again, we were going to split this into basically internal and international migration. So internal migration is people moving within the UK into Newcastle or out of Newcastle, and international migration is obviously people moving from other countries. Now for Newcastle, the biggest contributing of these two is internal migration. Internal migration is primarily through students actually. 1 in 6 residents of Newcastle is a university student. This is because it has 2 very good universities within the city. The University of Newcastle is a very high achieving, very popular university for the UK, so a large amount of students move into the city. As a result of that, if you were to look at a population pyramid of Newcastle, you'd see a large bulge in the kind of region of 18 to 25 year olds that was much higher than the UK average. At the same time, Newcastle does actually have a slightly smaller number of elderly people over the age of 65 than the UK average. This is probably due to people leaving the city and moving into rural areas as they retire. Now, in terms of the international global migration, it's actually got a very limited or small impact on Newcastle. Only around 4,000 international migrants move into Newcastle a year. That seems a lot, but actually in comparison to other cities of a similar size, it's very small. This is probably proved by the fact that only 12% of Newcastle's population will class themselves as non-British. Again, comparing that to other major cities in the UK, that is a very small amount. Okay, so we're going to move on to looking at some of the opportunities that are offered by Newcastle as a city or urban area in the UK. And one of the things that the exam spec asks us to look at is this idea of urban greening. We're going to represent that with a large tree off in this section here. So urban greening basically means the creation of green or high environmental quality areas in an urban area. They may include the creation or preservation of parks, even private gardens, allotments, sort of canal paths or paths along rivers. So any area that could be natural environment, a green area in the city. Now Newcastle qualifies really well for this. It's got several very large parks and even has its own town moor, so an area of moorland in the centre of the city, which is very rare for a large city such as Newcastle. Now, first off, we need to look at why urban greening is important and consider why having these green spaces is necessary. Now, on a large scale, we have to consider the fact that obviously green areas take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen into the atmosphere. So in terms of our fight against global warming and our fight against air pollution, green spaces within cities are very important. On a social side as well, green spaces are very good for residents of an urban area. They provide an area in which residents can exercise and therefore lead a healthier lifestyle. And more importantly, studies have shown that urban green areas are normally associated with less stress and a happier population. So we've got to look at actually, if Newcastle sees all these benefits of it, how do they promote green spaces within the city? And they've got lots of strategies. One of those is the creation of gardening fetes. So every year Newcastle has a festival fete celebrating kind of homegrown produce and sort of local gardens. The idea behind this is it would discourage people from paving over their garden or getting rid of their own private green spaces. The majority of green spaces within any city is actually private gardens, so the fetes are designed to stop people from neglecting these and going for the simple things such as putting down patio and actually trying to preserve things like lawns and flower beds. One of the other strategies that they do is Newcastle is surrounded by a large area of green belt. Now, the green belt is really important because it cannot be built on. There are laws that prevent from urban expansion and from development on that green belt land, so that will limit the growth of Newcastle into the surrounding countryside, and very few sort of planning proposals are allowed permission to build on greenfield sites. We will look at one later on that did manage to achieve that. Now, one of my favourite strategies in Newcastle is something that they call the green gym. Try and show that with a man doing some weightlifting. Now, the green gym is a really kind of innovative strategy in Newcastle. What they've done is they've set up a gym in some of the local parks, and rather than people paying a membership fee or a fee for their gym classes, the classes are given free on the condition that those people who receive them then provide help in terms of maintaining or preserving the green spaces in Newcastle. So that may be working in the parks, planting flower beds, keeping vegetation and other plants kind of in good health, pruning them, watering them and so on. So it's a really innovative strategy. They've cottoned onto the fact that particularly people at the moment are really conscious about their health and joining gyms, but they found a way of reducing the price of that and making it free, but then getting something back that helps them preserve their green spaces. Okay, so we're going to move away from the opportunities now, and we're going to start looking at the idea of challenges that an urban area such as Newcastle poses. Now, one of those challenges is the idea of urban sprawl. So urban sprawl is a really important term. It's the idea of the expansion of the city, the urban area, into the surrounding countryside. Now in Newcastle, that is pretty actually limited due to the fact that the majority, particularly to the north and west of the city, is greenbelt land. However, there have been some examples where planning and housing projects have been allowed to develop, and one of those is Newcastle Great Park. Now, Newcastle Great Park is an example of a greenfield site, and remember, you will need to think about some of the advantages and disadvantages of greenfield and brownfield sites in general, not necessarily related to Newcastle. Now, Newcastle Great Park also not only is an example of urban sprawl, but it's an example of a commuter settlement. So a commuter settlement is where people live, but then will work in another area. So, for example, the people in Newcastle Great Park will live there on the outskirts of the city, but commute every day into work. What we need to do is we need to look at the advantages and disadvantages of Newcastle Great Park and urban sprawl. What are some of the impacts it has? So if we break those down into positives and negatives. So, starting off with the negatives. Obviously, if you're a commuter settlement, you've got a large amount of people travelling on a daily basis. People travelling into Newcastle on a daily basis for commuting to work numbers around 90,000 people. So there's going to be a huge amount of traffic and congestion on our roads. Okay, the A1, for example, goes right past Newcastle Great Park, and since its creation, the A1 has become much busier. So there's much higher levels of pollution, okay, emitting things such as carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. One of the other negatives is the breakup and sort of dispersion of original rural communities who leave the area. Basically, all the villages get kind of swallowed up by the city as it expands, and we see those unique little rural villages basically broken up. One of the other problems, okay, is the fact that most of these urban sprawl areas are developed on what would have once been farmland. So we see the destruction of farmland areas and a reduction in crop yields. We also see the destruction of natural habitats. Okay, so for example, Newcastle Great Park was actually built on an area of red squirrel habitat. Now, the red squirrel is an incredibly rare species in the UK nowadays, so also the destruction of its habitat was a significant negative environmental impact. What are some of the advantages of urban sprawl and some of the positive impacts? Now, one of the major positives of any greenfield site, in particular Newcastle Great Park, is the opportunity to create larger family housing. Creation of this larger family housing, that provides large gardens and more open space. Obviously, the environmental quality may generally be higher as well, away from the city centre and away from that expected high levels of pollution there. One of the other positives as well is the creation of jobs in the area outside of the city. For example, companies may locate their headquarters into the new commuter settlement, shops, for example, located there so that people don't have to travel into the city centre. One of the next challenges I'm going to look at is the idea of urban deprivation. Now, urban deprivation basically means when the standard of living in an area is below the majority, or the standard for the majority in that given society. That may include hardships and a lack of access to basic facilities such as education, employment, and high quality housing. Now, Newcastle is a perfect example of this kind of idea of deprivation, with certain areas of the city being incredibly wealthy and other areas suffering from this idea of deprivation. And we're going to look at two of those areas. We're going to do it on this section here, okay, with our railway track. And the reason we've done that is because basically we're going to be looking at two areas at either end of the Newcastle Metro system. One of those areas is Parklands. The other area is Byker. Now, Byker is very similar to the quayside area in the sense that its economy was originally built on shipbuilding. It is one of the most deprived areas in Newcastle, and when we talk about the deprivation scale, which is basically based on a variety of measures such as access to education, employment, qualifications, wages, standard of housing, Byker comes out in the top 10% most deprived areas in the UK. Such data isn't even available for Parklands because it doesn't even come into that idea of deprivation. This is further emphasised by things such as housing. We said that deprivation may involve a lack of access to high quality housing, and that's shown by the average house price. In Byker, we're looking at £100,000 as the average house price. It is 4 times higher, £400,000, for the average house price in Parklands. Unemployment is also a good indicator of deprivation. Okay. In terms of the percentage of the population that are unemployed, Byker has a staggering 18% of its population unemployed. That compares to only 2% in Parklands. So we've got this huge variation in deprivation and wealth. We've got to consider why that's the case. And basically it comes down to a kind of negative multiplier effect, or a cycle. If we take Byker, as we said, as our deprived area, we've got to look at what happened there. Now, Byker, as I said, had a very similar economy to the quayside area of Newcastle, built basically on the shipbuilding industry. When that shipbuilding industry disappeared and moved into other markets abroad where it could be done for a sort of cheaper price, Byker obviously suffered from high unemployment. Many of its inhabitants had been solely employed in that shipbuilding and no longer had a source of income. That resulted in a lack of tax income for the area. As a result of that, we saw a lack of spending in the area. Things such as basic facilities such as schooling and healthcare services would have gone into decline. To such an extent that actually Byker doesn't have its own secondary school, and any young people living in that area do travel out of the ward and into another part of Newcastle. As a result of that, what you're going to see is maybe a lack of motivation and a lack of attention and care regarding education. So many young people growing up in Byker don't have access to good education, and due to the lack of available jobs, don't see the merit in working hard at school. As a result of that, they leave school with very few qualifications, therefore find it hard to get a job. As a result of that, we then see this cycle of low income, therefore even less tax income from the area and less spending on those facilities. We also normally see with a low income an issue such as poor diet, poor quality housing, which results in poor health and lifestyles, which normally lowers life expectancy as well, and so on and so on. The cycle carries on looping, hence the idea of a multiple negative multiplier effect. So the last thing that we're going to look at with Newcastle is our integrated transport scheme or strategy. And for that we're going to look at the Newcastle Metro. Now, when we talk about an integrated transport scheme, what we mean is it's a public transport network where all different types of transport are linked. So for example, the Metro is a prime example of this, as it connects up with most of Newcastle's major car parks, major bus routes and other forms of transport, including the ferry terminal, the airport, and is linked to most of Newcastle's major attractions, including the football stadium. Now, what we want to look at is actually, firstly, the successes of the strategy. The Newcastle Metro system has been incredibly popular. There are 40 stations and over 40 million journeys a year on the Metro. It's massively decreased car usage in the city. It's also incredibly effective and efficient. Because of the fact that congestion has obviously been reduced due to the use of the Metro, we've seen a massive decrease in stress levels for commuters in Newcastle. We all know that congestion, being stuck in traffic, causes a large amount of stress. So therefore, by decreasing that and given a integrated and connected transport strategy such as the Metro, which allows people to travel around Newcastle, has meant that stress levels have decreased. One of the other major positives of the Newcastle Metro system is the fact that it's actually made living in Newcastle more affordable. One of the major issues for most people working in Newcastle was that they couldn't afford to live in the city centre, but they did need to live near the city centre because that's where their work was. Every stop you go out on the Metro, we see a decrease in rent price of £86 a month. That's allowed people to live further out of the city centre, afford a larger house at a cheaper price, but still commute very quickly and cheaply into the city centre for their work. One of the other big advantages, obviously, is the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and air pollution has decreased due to that reduced car usage. We can start to categorise here about social, economic and environmental positives of the integrated transport strategy that is Newcastle Metro. However, there are some negatives. The question in the exam is likely to ask you to evaluate the effectiveness of the strategy, and you can't evaluate without considering some negatives. Newcastle remains one of the most congested cities in the UK. In fact, it's the 8th most congested city. So despite the reduced car usage that the Metro is encouraged, it still has a long way to go. On top of that, pollution levels from that high congestion regularly exceed the safe limits on Newcastle's major streets in the city centre, particularly during rush hour. One of the other big issues as well is a recent study suggested that on a yearly basis, Newcastle loses around £7 million a year due to people being stuck in traffic when they should be at work, people missing meetings, deliveries being late, and so on. So if you're going to consider whether or not it's successful, yes, we do have a certain degree of success, but in evaluating it, you have to accept that there are still some major issues. So, you should end up with a diagram looking something like that, with a large variety of challenges, opportunities, and reasons why Newcastle is an important city in the UK.